think we would just disagree on like what sports exactly are the ones that prioritize aesthetics. To me, would be things like chess and maybe football and just anything that requires a lot of technical skill, like MMA is another example. So yeah, that's my opening statement.
Thanks for your opening statement, man. So excited to be here today. Thank you all for joining us for the debate. My name's Bogan. So today I want to talk about aesthetics being the priority. What makes something a great sport? What I mean by aesthetics is a kind of judgment or attitude, a kind of experience. The important feature is the relationship an individual has to the sport, the intersection of competition and art. Man, the greatest moments in sport are those we call beautiful, magnificent, awe-inspiring. Many have called my leg drop a magnificent and awe-inspiring move. These are all words that have an aesthetic content. Ooh, that's right, brother man. I accept Sweet's definition, Sweet being a philosopher. The definition of sport being a competitive event involving a variety of physical or mental human skills where the superior participant is judged to have exhibited those skills in a superior way. And now I want to talk about what I mean by greatest. Greatest is indexed to the subject in my view. And here, when I say greatest, I mean that in which the individual has an aesthetic experience in relation to viewing the sport. Yeah, one that inspires the use of those aesthetics words such as beautiful, magnificent, majestic, and excellent. As with this knowledge that I declare, the greatest sports are those that prioritize the aesthetic, which goes without saying. That means the World Wrestling Federation does it the best.
Okay. So I think that have some like good I think we mostly agree on our definition, except I would add things like um not a lot of random factors. For example, like to win it has to be based on skill and it can't be like chance or like luck. So I would say that's like one thing that has to happen for it to be a sport.
That's right, I would agree. It's not based on love.
Right. Um yeah, and
Seems to
we
me
agreed
like,
things
oh, I'm
like
sorry.
it's okay. We agreed things like marching band and ballet competitions count as well.
That's right. Unless it's
Okay.
not a competition for the marching band, in which case I might not consider it a sport.
Okay, so you seem to like really be heavy on the competitive element.
For it to be a sport, that's right.
Yeah, okay. I think we've got it down. Has to be competitive. It can't be random. Things like that. So, what would you say is the greatest sport to you based off of your criteria?
World Wrestling Federation.
I actually disagree. I think mixed martial arts is more complex than wrestling and more like aesthetic.
Well, on one hand, I agree with you because the aesthetic is indexed to the subject. On the other hand, I think I can make an argument for why there's more aesthetic prioritization for World Wrestling Federation than the MMA.
What's your argument?
Well, the World Wrestling Federation has many different types of aesthetics there. For one, it usually hires bodybuilders. Bodybuilding is itself a type of aesthetic sport where you prioritize the way the body looks. Oh, the people who are competing are there already as a type of aesthetic object. But in MMA, you don't have to look like an aesthetic object, you're just there for the skill. So, in that regard, I think there's a symmetry breaker between World Wrestling Federation and MMA.
Hmm. But MMA includes like wrestling, a lot of the elements of wrestling, yet even more techniques and styles. You kind of have to have a lot of these things under your belt to be a good fighter, and that requires a lot of judgment, which
Well,
I thought you said was part of aesthetics.
there are many skills and techniques in World Wrestling Federation as well. For example, there's a performative aspect of it. Like myself, when I walk on stage, I have a character. I flex my muscles, I put oil on my body, and I talk a big game. That's a type of skill, a type of performing skill that's necessary for the World Wrestling Federation to be successful. And it's a typically aesthetic skill.
Hmm. Right, but I feel like MMA makes it harder because you don't have to rely on things like that. And also, in wrestling, there's less focus on your like skill because a lot of times you already know who's gonna win.
Oh, you don't? Those competitions are decided live.
Really? Like I thought I always heard that they decide who's gonna win before. And I think the performative stuff kind of takes away from the competition, and that might harm the like sport part of it.
Performance is part of the competition. In order for these wrestlers to win, they need to have the crowd on their side. And the best way to get the crowd on your side is to perform better. That's why Hulkamania is immortal. It's an immortal aesthetic judgment that the crowd has on who's gonna perform better. And you mentioned something about MMA having a type of skill, but I wouldn't say it's an aesthetic skill. And when that skill is done well, it's the audience judging it from an aesthetic way that gives it its potency. So even though the skill is important, it's only that skill which makes us go, that was beautiful, that would make us say, that was good skill. Otherwise, we'd be watching a bunch of robots.
Well, sometimes the bad guys win in wrestling, and then people get like mad about it. And in
That's
MMA,
right.
I'd say there's still some aesthetics, like you have to build up like an audience for yourself, and you have to be popular, and you do have to have a fan base. And I think there's some aesthetic aspects in MMA, kind of like um the blood and the gore, and also like different types of fighting style, like footwork, and everyone has their own unique air to them and how they fight. So it is stylistic and performative too.
I absolutely agree that there's an aesthetic there. That is so totally true. I greatly admire their aesthetics. But I don't think that they have the most aesthetics. I think wrestling has more prioritization of aesthetics. In fact, I would say all sports have some aesthetic value. Otherwise, we wouldn't call it a sport in the first place.
Fair enough, but I think MMA has a lot more variety. And you could argue that since wrestling is more based on performance and less on that judgment and skill, it could be less of a sport in itself.
Oh, the audience is judging based on a type of skill. The audience is cheering on the wrestler who performs the stunt better. Like my leg drop. My leg drop inspired millions of people across the country. They loved it so much that Hulkamania became immortal. I can't think of a single immortal move from MMA. No one would ever talk about an MMA move with some type of aesthetic idolization like the leg drop.
A lot of people actually idolize punching styles or someone's ability to like get someone to submit or how someone like kept getting up during a fight or for example like someone like Tony Ferguson, their endurance, and that's kind of like a personality you put on your general like style of how you fight.
I agree, people tend to idolize the way someone punches. That type of aesthetic is not for one person. That's something that's indexed to a type of martial art. So they're not having an aesthetic judgment based on the person using the technique, but about the martial art and their skill at performing the martial art. But the aesthetic here for Wrestling Federation is the wrestler is the aesthetic object, and the audience member has a relationship, an aesthetic experience when they watch that object perform my glorious leg drop.
What do you mean by this leg drop you keep mentioning?
Oh no.
Like, are you referring to anything, or is it just like a
Oh, I am. The leg drop is my seminal move. I would use it to win matches all the time. I'd jump in the air, I'd do an L sit, and I'd land on someone's face with the back of my knee.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. I see your point with what you said about wrestling versus MMA, but since wrestling is so like performative and sometimes the winner gets predetermined in like certain fights, the sport side is kind of like pushed aside and it becomes more of a show or an act than a sport.
Why do you think it's not a sport?
I just said it's like, well, I
But
mean, I didn't say it wasn't, but it's kind of less of a sport than a lot of other things that are sports because it's so played up and performative.
that's the part that's being judged. Here's the performance. The way that these people are winning the match is the person who's getting the audience, who's getting all of their attention and favor. That's how they decide the champions, and they perform the stunt better by performing these skills in the best way. They get the audience to cheer for them.
I
Judgment there is
mean,
about the performance.
just because something is a competition and like just a competition doesn't make it a sport.
Read that again for me.
Yeah, okay. Just because something is a competition doesn't make it a sport. Like not all competitions are sports.
Can you give me an example that's not a sport but is a competition?
Um, like acting or writing, like a poetry competition.
What kind of competitions or acting competitions?
Like sometimes in high school, like there would be like speech where you would like go and you like do a musical theater performance or a monologue and you would get judged from like a few judges, for example.
Oh, that's right. I would consider the competition on a monologue performance a type of sport, but I wouldn't consider all acting a sport.
Okay. I'd say it's more of a performance art. 'Cause, like, since not all acting is sports, that kind of, like, goes like, the acting that wrestlers do doesn't automatically make it a sport simply because 'cause they're, like, being judged by an audience.
I agree with you, the acting doesn't automatically make it a sport. But where I think it changes is that their audience is judging how this person is performing. And it's not just saying a monologue and it's not just doing a little dance, but it's a physical stunt that's taking place. Something that requires a lot of technical physical skill. And so the combination of the audience judging the skill they see before their very eyes, that is what makes it the sport, the competition of the physical stunt performance. That's why they call it the people's choice.
But, um, the actual competition is who wins in itself, and I think MMA also requires even more technicality. I know some of the, like, wrestlers lose on purpose.
Losing on purpose is a type of performance and requires a skill in order to pretend like you're in the stunt, performing effortlessly, but also making it look like you're getting your butt whooped. That's a type of performance skill. Now, I agree with you. There's a lot more craft involved with someone who does MMA fighting, but we're not solely concerned with craft in the sports here. We're concerned with the aesthetic judgment, because it's not just being able to perform the skill well, but it having to perform the skill well and beautifully. That's the thing that's attracting people to the sport in the first place, because sports is this interaction between the play and the art. So I think in World Wrestling Federation, that interplay is heightened to an experience that is intoxicating to the audience. But MMA doesn't do the same thing. More people are going to nerd out on the craft rather than the aesthetic. And for that reason, I think World Wrestling Federation is a greater sport.
But the skill isn't for the purpose of winning, it's just acting, like, it's and I thought you said that the
Uh,
greatest sports were those that prioritize aesthetics, like, not craft.
that's right. The crowd is voting based on aesthetics. And it's not just acting, but it's acting to win the crowd.
But that's still, like, a show. Like, it's not 'cause someone who wins the crowd could possibly, like, be predetermined to lose.
Determined by who? Vince McMahon?
Yeah, or, like, someone
Donald
like, I don't
Trump?
know if he's the only, like, wrestling boss, just whoever's deciding.
Reason why. Let's just grant, for the sake of argument here, that those at the top picked who would win. The reason why they would win in the first place is because they know how the audience would react to it. They've already won the audience over, and that's why they might throw the match in the first place, to set up the conditions for the audience to choose in the future. It's always the audience that's choosing.
Then why do heels win some of the time? Or, like, the
Revenge
bad guy?
tours are a lot of fun.
What? I'm sorry.
Revenge tours are a lot of fun. You know what a
But
revenge tour
that's
is?
Um, is it just like a wrestler having like a chance to like win against someone when they lost before?
That's right.
Right, but the audience isn't choosing that if they're a heel and they like boo and stuff.
Oh, they're being chosen by the audience. So the person who wins is chosen. But then later, the person who loses is also chosen. They're chosen because the people guessing are thinking the audience will choose in this way or react in this way. It's the aesthetic judgment of the audience that's guiding who's winning and losing.
Wait, what was the last part of what you said? Sorry.
It's the perceived aesthetic judgment. I added the word perceived, so it's slightly different than what I said, but it's the perceived aesthetic judgment of the audience that's guiding who's winning and losing. And then we observe what's happening in the audience, see what will happen in the next match, and the next match, and the next match.
Right, but even though like wrestling can be aesthetic in some ways, I think it barely skirts the definition of a sport because winners aren't winning based on like skills because the results are like chosen beforehand.
Not always. As an assumption, we'd have to prove it. I would say this:
Right,
there are
right.
some things deciding the match, like for example, a 3 count. If I pin someone for a 3 count, then I win.
Yeah, that can factor in too. That's not, but like a lot of times, like they know who's gonna win before, and it's just kind of played up to make it seem differently.
That's right. But let's just say, for your argument here, that we just grant World Wrestling Federation is not a sport. I think the proposition still stands that we would decide what sport is the greatest is that which prioritizes the aesthetic value.
But I believe I already agreed with you through that through text, and we were gonna debate more about what sports are the greatest.
Hmm.
Yeah, cause
Well, and I'll just move on to a different sport.
yeah, that works.
Violin
I just wanted to
competitions
make sure,
are the greatest sport.
ballet competitions.
Violin.
Ooh, okay. Hmm. I mean, violin is a pretty technical instrument, so I get where you're coming from. But I think marching band requires a bigger collection of diverse skill. Like there's people playing multiple different instruments and they have to multitask. So I think marching band could potentially be a candidate for greater sport than violin competitions.
Because someone has to beat a drum and blow a trumpet at the same time? I don't think so. With the violin, it's a very complicated instrument. Not only that, but the stakes are quite high in a competition. They're world renowned, like the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto competition. In fact, that was a competition that the United States and Russia competed against for the Cold War for the aesthetic status of being the superior system. So the competition had multiple areas where it was acting to decide who was the winner.
But in marching band, you like in a violin competition, it's mostly you or like you and an accompanist, so you have less to process around you. But in marching band, you have to be aware of like your own part and your own like feet and your own like place, but also everyone else's.
I don't understand how one of those is harder than the other, though.
I just think, like, especially since, like, um, does the Tchaikovsky violin competition make you memorize your piece? Can't
Everything,
remember.
yep.
Okay,
35
same
minute
with
long
marching band.
piece. You have to know all the parts of the other instruments in order to know when to play and how to tune.
Also, I don't wanna use this generally marching band, do you know what DCI is?
That's right, I do.
Yeah, I think that could be even more skilled than your general, like, high school marching band. So, in DCI,
Are we differentiating between team sports here and individual sports?
mm, maybe we should compare the same type of sports each time.
I like that idea.
So, I think I wanna go to, like, chess, because
Great,
we talked about
fantastic.
that too. So, I think chess is more skilled than a violin competition.
I don't agree that it's more skilled. I think violin is more difficult to master than a chess game.
But I think violin competitions could be slightly less of a sport since there's more random factors, like your accompanist could mess up, your instrument could or your strings could break all of a sudden, but in chess, it's more like straight and logical and there's like these calculations you have to make. And that's like probably one of the like the only factor that's gonna cause you to win or lose.
There's a certain amount of skill in chess that's required, but I'm determining what's greatest based on aesthetic value. I don't necessarily agree that there's more skill required for the chess master just because things are safer and more logical. In fact, I would say that makes the violinist's job more difficult because the strings can go out of tune and then the violinist must need know how to play in tune even though the bass is all out of whack.
But that's a random factor, and chess could be considered more sporty. And also,
Wait, why does that make it more sporty?
because we agreed part of our definition of a sport was like it being skill based and not having many random factors like
That's
chance.
right. The judgment wouldn't be based on the random factors in the violin competition. It would be based on the skill of the violinist. I mean,
But you
there
can't
are there are
always
random
tell.
factors for chess. Like, for example, a chess master could get massive diarrhea.
So could a violin player.
That's right,
And
both could.
I mean,
I
so at
don't
least in
understand.
chess, sorry,
Oh, you go ahead.
at least in chess, you're sitting down during the diarrhea, but if you play the violin, like, you're gonna wanna sit down.
That'd be
It's probably
okay.
gonna hurt.
You can sit down and play.
'Cause I thought they always didn't give people chairs.
They usually require people to stand and play.
Right, yeah.
But if you have a disability, say, like Itzhak Perlman, you're allowed to sit just fine.
Okay. Well, I still think, like, something like a random health emergency can still happen in chess, just like a violin competition.
Right, I mean, I think that a board could have some malfunction. Someone could spill water all over the pieces and they'd have to get a new board. Don't see how that suddenly makes violin competitions not a sport.
I didn't say it wasn't a sport, I just said it's, like, less of a sport than chess, and also, like, you could technically play chess without using your hands because it's very mind-based, but a violin requires, like, your limbs, and you could, like, have a spasm or something like that.
I don't understand how that's an argument for why it's not a sport, though.
Because there's, like, more you have to worry about when playing a violin, so, like, there's more, like, health factors that come in, like a
Well, because
muscle tear.
violin is more physical than chess.
Yeah.
To move your arms and your fingers as an athlete of the micro muscles. In chess, you can play blind. You can have someone else move your pieces for you. There's no physical there at all. So, as a test of physical skill, I think a violin competition is more of a sport than chess.
Mm, but in our definition of sport, we didn't say it had to be physical.
Oh, we didn't say it had to be physical, but if we're pointing to the physical features here, I would say violin is more of a sport. If we point to the mental features, there are quite a bit of mental skills and tactics that go into being a good violinist that I think apply to being a good chess player too.
I just think it's overall skill because, like, you can have, like, mental sports. I think chess would be one of those.
Yeah, but playing music is an overall skill as well.
I just think chess requires a more narrow, calculative mindset, so it requires, like, more judgment and everything than, like, a violin competition would.
Why is there the calculative judgment being necessary for it to be more of a sport here? There's plenty of calculation and judgment when it comes to playing an instrument.
But I
Doesn't
think
have to
there's more.
follow.
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
I think there's more in chess because it's kind of like math problems, like, just a bunch of, like, calculating and learning different moves and thinking of patterns, and music is kind of like, um, more more it allows for more, like, freedom outside of that, like, creative freedom, obviously.
There's a lot of memorization and patterns. Let me ask you a question to get to the analogy I have in mind. Have you seen the movie Free Solo?
No.
Well, do you agree rock climbing is a sport?
Yeah.
All right,
Well,
so now
only if it's competitive.
In Free Solo, Alex Honnold climbed El Capitan without a rope. In order to do that, there wasn't any skill involved that would be analogous to playing chess. He memorized a bunch of moves. He memorized them perfectly. It was necessary, otherwise he would die. He became the first person to free solo El Capitan. That's
But I
one of the
think
greatest
chess
athletic and sports achievements in history, but it's a memorized sequence of events like playing the violin would be.
I think chess is um like, you have to be more adaptable in chess, while, like, music is just kind of like memorizing a song. I think you have to do a lot more. You have
But
to have a lot more, like, skills under your belt in chess.
adaptability wasn't part of the requirements for it to be a sport. Never agreed on that.
I think it's part of the skill. Like, adaptability can be a skill.
Sure, but I don't think you always have to have adaptability in order for it to be a sport.
No, but I think it makes chess, like, more of a sport or more, like, technical and skilled.
I guess I'm confused about something being more of a sport. I just kind of see it as a category. It is a sport, and then we talk about how great the sport is.
I think I might, yeah. Like, I think we can both agree that they're both sports, and we just need to talk about what is the greatest. Like, I'm sorry if you felt like I was, like, equivocating.
Oh no, no, I didn't think you were. I just wanted to clarify.
I see, I see.
I think what makes something the greatest sport is that which prioritizes the aesthetic.
Yes.
And for that reason, I think something like a violin competition, because the aesthetic is so important, that would be one of the greatest sports. Greater than chess, because it's not because the position looks pretty or the person is doing it in a pretty way that makes it good. It's just because they're following the rules of the game and coming up with nifty little sequences and solutions to problems. Call something like a math competition aesthetically beautiful. We would in the case of the violin, though.
But I thought you said that aesthetic was a kind of judgment, attitude, or experience, and I think chess requires a lot of judgment.
I think the judgment in chess is based on the rules of the game rather than how pretty it looks.
I didn't think we were using pretty in aesthetic. Like, I thought you had kind of like a French definition of aesthetic, and we were adhering to that.
Oh no, in my opening statement, I was talking about aesthetic words we apply to sports, like beautiful, magnificent,
Right, right,
majestic. I think that's whenever humans are using those words, there's a content there describing their experience.
right. Well, could intriguing be a word we apply? Or maybe like fascinating or yeah, things like that.
Yes, that could apply, and I can see someone finding a chess position intriguing. For sure. However, the sport itself is not prioritizing someone feel intrigued.
It can because it's like meant to be very like skilled and technical, so it has a lot of like complicated and complex moves that are going to catch someone's eye or like catch their like interest.
I think they catch their interest in the same way that perhaps prime numbers catch people's interest. They see patterns in prime numbers. I don't think the sport is prioritizing those aesthetics. I just think those are the aesthetics that people are finding in the board game.
Hmm.
I would agree with you that perhaps people people's favorite chess players are those that play with a type of aesthetic flash, like Magnus Carlsen or Mikhail Tal.
Or Bobby Fischer.
Yes, or Bobby Fischer, although I don't think he's that aesthetically pleasing of a player. Mikhail Tal was way more aesthetic than Bobby Fischer.
Yeah, I actually think you have to develop your own personal set of said chess skills. Like, you need to know what openings you wanna do, if you're an aggressive or passive player. I mean, well, aggressive or defensive player, things like that.
I agree that there are lots of skills there. I think what makes a sport great is the aesthetics. With something like a violin competition, what's being judged is the aesthetics, the player deciding how fast to move the bow, where to add these little micro crescendos, the types of sounds people wouldn't even be aware of, but would have a reaction to. But in chess, we can look at the things that people are reacting to specifically, like, oh, this sacrifice was amazing. Who would sacrifice their queen in this position? Had no idea. Wow, that's stunning. Versus, wow, the person made me feel something deep here on a piece I've heard a million times. That's a type of skill that's deep and aesthetic.
Okay, I think I'll agree with you on chess being less great than violin competitions, but I think singing competitions are more aesthetic.
Now we're talking.
Like, singing is, like, so integral and unique to everybody, like, it's your voice, and you have your, like you automatically have your, like, own flair to it.
Oh, violinists add their own flair to it as well.
But I think it's even more when it's the human voice,
Why?
and because it's, like, personal to you, like, it's literally a part of you, so it's very,
I think the violin's part of a
diverse.
violinist too. Their fingers are part of them. The way they move the bow is part of
Mm,
them. The imagination for the music they create is part of them. Happens to be more externalized, but I would say it's as equally a part of them. Difference is
yeah,
their body isn't the resonating body of the instrument.
yeah, but I think, singing allows for a lot more dynamics and range than an instrument would, because the human voice can be very, like, adaptable and has a lot more, like, range, like I said.
What do you mean by range here?
Like, for example, I play, like, the bass clarinet, so I play a lot of low notes, but I could meet, like, someone who, can reach a lot of, like, those notes, like, I'm playing bass clarinet, but they can also sing a lot higher, so they ha
You cut out for me. Neighbors, I can hear you.
Hello?
I can hear you now.
Yeah, I think I lost connection, sorry.
Oh, it's all right.
Yeah, just, more range in terms of pitch.
I'm not so convinced. I think that the range of a string instrument is quite large. Not every singer has as wide a range as, for example, every violin has the same range as all other violins, but not every soprano has the same range.
But I think it's easier to make it adaptable and there's more potential. Like the violin's always gonna be limited to the notes it can already do. Well, except for things like harmonics.
When you
But
can detune the strings and make the range bigger.
but that's a lot harder to like play with other people and that might be like undesirable in like a violin competition because sometimes they like want people to like tune to a certain note or something.
I mean, it just seems to me that voice and the instrument is gonna have some type of limitation. For example, a string instrument can play two notes at once, but a singer can only sing one note at a time.
I mean, But they could also, like, add more dynamics, and it could be, like, more personal to said person, while a violin could just, like, sound like any other violin.
That's why it's more of a skill for the violinist to make it sound personal.
Mm. But singers sometimes have to deal with, like, an oversaturated, like, market or, like, in musical theater, a lot of the times they, like wait, never mind, we agreed that's not a sport, but, like, if you're at, a singing competition, they're gonna wanna look for someone who's, like, unique and can bring their own unique, like, flair to a piece.
I think they look for the same thing for the violinist, though. They're looking
But I
for
think it can be
originality
hard.
there. I think it's harder for the violinist to be original, sound original, compared to everyone else.
Mm. I guess it depends on, like, the person too.
That's right, perhaps. I think that market is saturated for both singers and violinists. Seems to me that it's probably equal.
Yeah, like, we would need, like, a statistic to make, like, an actual conclusion about that, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me like you and I agree on quite a bit. We just maybe have differences of what we think is the most great sport based on our own personal subjectivity,
Yeah,
which
right, like
is
we
fine
talked
by
about
me.
that.
Yeah, I think it is subjective at the end of the day. Um, it's hard to know. There's, I'm not sure. Maybe we should leave it to a vote. What do you think?
Yeah, that sounds good. So, like, do you wanna do a closing statement, or was that your closing statement?
Maybe I'll just do a little review. I can go first, and you can have the last word if you like.
Sure.
I just want to reiterate that I think the greatest sports are those that prioritize the aesthetic. My interlocutor does not think the World Wrestling Federation is such a sport. Disagree there, but I'm fine granting that it's not. I do think that something like a violin competition would fit as a sport. But what I'm really concerned with is the notion that the aesthetic, the prioritization of the aesthetic, is what's making it the greatest sport. So, because I think that a sport is that intersection between competition and art, and what makes it a great competition is when the art is great and prioritized. Thank you very much for listening today, and I want to thank my neighbors because I thought they did a great job in the debate, and thank you all for listening to my annoying voice.
So thank you to, like, everyone who came to moderate and listen, and to Bogan, because he was really funny, and I think he did a good job. Um, I believe him when I clarified it first. We already, like, through texting, we had agreed a couple of days prior to this debate, we weren't gonna talk as much about the greatest sports having aesthetics, but what the greatest sports are, so that's why I focused more on that. I don't think well, I agree, my opponent and I, like, agree on, what sports need to have to be great. I don't think they've shown that wrestling is better than MMA, or that, violin competitions are quite as great as wrestling. I mean, singing sorry, violin competitions are quite as great as singing. Thank you.